Nadine Smith is co-founder and CEO of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And she has taken this organization to the forefront of the national gay rights movement. She recounts her growing up days in Florida as a Black lesbian female, and also delivers a treatise on how to become a successful gay rights organization. She is an amazing woman with an amazing story. Bon appetit.
My favorite thing, my sort of comfort food, it reminds me of my mother, and she used to make it when we were kids, is rice pudding. And it's the kind that's not real mushy, and it's got a lot of nutmeg, has that little film on the top, made with canned milk and, a little bit of sugar, and it's just, it's just home for me.
Thanks, Nadine.
I grew up in Panama City, Florida, up in the Panhandle, and very, very conservative part of the state. Dark red territory, completely a Republican stronghold. I remember when I was in school, there was a rumor that one of our teachers was gay. I mean, and that I was fascinated by the possibility that there was a gay teacher, because I didn't think there was any gay people in that town, except that I in elementary school, or actually it was probably 6th or 7th grade, I remember going through the Dewey Decimal System, flipping through the catalog, and I found a card that said homosexuality. And I remember I looked it up, I looked up the book, and it basically said that homosexual women hate men, they dress in a particular way, and all of these things. And I thought, well, I don't hate men. I don't particularly wear that fashion, but then it said bisexuals, and basically the definition of bisexuals was sort of like, they're sneaky and they appear to be like anybody else, but, and I thought I might be a sneaky bisexual, and I was very concerned. But I remember looking up books, and one would lead to the next book. But it was back when you had to sign your own name on the card, and they put the card in the sleeve so you could see everybody who checked out that book. And I remember taking that, looking around, seeing who checked it out, and going, I knew it. So there was no way I was going to get my name on any of those books. And I tricked this friend of mine I told her I'd checked out too many books, and would she check these books out for me. But that's the level of paranoia and fear and everything around us reinforced this idea. You'd hear coaches use homophobic slurs, sometimes racist slurs, with impunity. And every message you got was hide, and if you're not successful hiding, you better lie. And so I did a great job of hiding. I remember when I was in elementary school, I had my first girlfriend, and we used to sit together, and I was crazy in love. I was so in love that I would give her my chocolate pudding, which even to this day, to give up chocolate pudding is just. But I remember she told our teacher that we were going to get married, and our teacher kept us in the classroom right before lunch, and in a very grave voice told us that girls had to marry boys and boys had to marry girls, which I literally took to mean had to at some point. You would choose one, or one would be assigned to you, but somehow this was going to have to happen. And we were devastated. I mean, we went to lunch and we sat under the tree that we always sat under, and she cried, and I was livid. I was just like, anyway. And I remember I remember thinking to myself, I didn't know what gaydar was, but I clearly had it, because I went up to this little boy who was the most effeminate little boy in our class, and I said, listen, you and I are going to get married, and then I'm going to call her Ashley. Ashley is going to come and live with us after her husband gets killed in the war. And
I'm not supposed to laugh because it'll be on the soundtrack. Oh, God.
But so yes, that was
Okay.
that was an early moment where I got the message loud and clear that I really shouldn't tell anybody else, and I didn't for a number of years. And but that process, around race and around gender, the kind of injury that gets done by people close to you who love you in all sorts of ways, but for them this is a blind spot, and in that blind spot they do so much harm. Whether it's intentionally because they know you are and they think that they can beat it out of you, or church it out of you, or shame it out of you, or whatever it is they think they're doing it in a culture that tells them that's what love looks like. So a lot of this work is getting people to challenge these ideas that they've held that they've never examined. And I find that in that journey people are grateful that you finally let them let go of that. They're relieved not to have to carry that anymore. Growing up black and female and gay in the Panhandle, you see things from what Bell Hooks calls from the margins. I think it's the reason I became a reporter, because I was used to examining situations, from a certain remove, more like an anthropologist moving through the world, in part because I was always evaluating the danger and safety of various situations and understanding the dynamics of how groups and people move together. I think Cornel West may have said that there's a part of the black experience where part of your hard drive is constantly spinning to assess what impact racism is having on it at any given time. And I think that's true for the LGBT community. I said the other day to somebody that without ever talking about it, I find that gay people have an implicit understanding of what neighborhoods it is considered safe to walk around in holding hands. And that never having said this to any, shared that information specifically, if you set us down and asked us to draw a picture, I bet the pictures would be remarkably similar. And it's that way of constantly collecting and evaluating information about a level of safety, especially when you've grown up in a place where violence directed at people for being different in whichever way they're different was quite common. So I think the experience of growing up in the Panhandle and seeing racism and seeing homophobia in full display, but the other is that my grandparents, I think, instilled in their children and thereby passed on to us a sense of justice, a sense that while they may not have been key figures in the civil rights movement, they did things. For example, my grandparents on my father's side were part of the first interracial farming co-op. It was in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. And my grandfather moved the family to New York, as my father says, because he didn't want to teach his children not to make eye contact with white people and knew it was dangerous if they didn't have that sort of look away and hide mentality. So, they raised me to stand up for myself in an environment that was very racist. They taught me, you're not better than other people, but absolutely nobody's better than you. And I remember in my elementary school, they used to paddle kids, corporal punishment, big wooden paddle. And it was clear that, black kids got paddled more than white kids. And so my parents said to me two things. One, you don't have to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. You can be respectful, but you don't have to say that. And nobody hits you at school. So I remember I had dropped my pencil. And my teachers were, this one teacher in particular, she didn't like me from the beginning. My transcripts, the bottom line was I was reading ahead of the class. And I think she thought I didn't know my place. Anyway, I remember I dropped my pencil one day and it broke, and the lead broke, and she told me I did it on purpose to disrupt the class. And anyway, she told me to go outside, out in the hall, and she was going to paddle me for breaking my pencil. And I said, no, you're not. And she said, you can get paddled or you can go home. And I walked home. I walked all the way home, across busy roads. I'll never forget the look of shock on my mother's face when I walked through the door. And my mother was always a very mild-mannered person, very British and very proper. But she got me in the car, drove me back to school, and I sat outside while she laid into the principal like, you know, I was, I think I was 2 inches taller when she was done. But that was the environment. So my parents were teaching us to stand up for ourselves and not be bullied. And they just didn't know they were teaching all of those things to a little lesbian as well. So it's always been part of the world I moved in and the lessons I was taught by my elders that you stand up. Having said that, I did get the message early on that this is something I should really keep to myself. And in fact, Andy Tobias, writing under a pen name, wrote Best Little Boy in the World, and basically a book about growing up gay and how the tendency to be excellent at everything, as though if you can excel at enough things, when this little secret comes out, maybe you will have banked enough points that, you know, your family will still love you, you'll still have some place. So that's a common experience. I mean, I think like on a Quality Florida staff, you'll find a bunch of, you know, senior class presidents and, you know, people who, you know, were superstars in high school. But I think a lot of it's driven by that phenomenon. Like, I've got to be the best because one day the secret's going to upend my world. So my activism, you know, sort of was the natural outgrowth of a family that taught us to stand up for ourselves. In November, I'm going to go to Dublin. November of this year, I'll be in Dublin for the 30th anniversary of the International Gay Lesbian Youth Organization. I was on the founding board, and I was not even 20 yet when we founded it. And the thing that I remember most was going there, going to the meeting in London, and not being, I didn't have a politics about being gay. I knew I was gay. I just didn't have, you know, I hadn't read Homophobia, Weapon of Sexism. I didn't have a political context to put that in. But I remember at one of our subsequent meetings in Berlin, a group of our guys got beat up by American GIs. And when they returned to the headquarters, I remember thinking, I didn't say out loud, but I remember thinking, yeah, that's what happens. You got to be careful out there. You guys should have been a little more cautious out there. Now, all around me, everybody else was, this is an outrage. We're going to have a demonstration. We're going to demand an apology. They pointed at me, call the American embassy. And I thought, call the American embassy? Oh, wait, this is actually how people should react in the face of a violent attack. Where did I learn to blame the victim and, you know, and see that the problem was they weren't secret enough? You know, I mean, it's like, and it was a moment where I realized how insidious homophobia is, in particular, because it causes you to do the work of the bigots for them. And where I had lots of people in my immediate family who were support when it came to racism, female teachers did not hide the fact that they were female, and if you went to them with issues of being harassed, you know, because you were a girl, they stepped up, generally. But the total isolation of knowing that, you know, I knew I was gay since I was, you know, in 3rd grade or maybe even more. I never didn't know, right? So, so for me, it became a moment where I realized, man, this poison is deep. This poison, I mean, it is so deep that I can't even tell where it begins, you know, where it ends and I begin. So for me, so much of this work and so much of what has fired me up about this work is that it is a journey to a destination, but it's also the journey itself is the detoxing of that poison. Much of it provided to me by people who loved me and wanted to protect me and didn't know how. And so that's part of it, that every time I step into those places that are a little bit scary, I'm getting rid of some more of that poison. But also, I want to be the adult, I think, more than anything else. I want to be the adult that wasn't there for me when I was a kid. Well, Equality Florida was actually formed in 1997. Before that, there were predecessor organizations. But when we became Equality Florida was the moment where we said two things had to happen. One, we had to truly be statewide. We were born in the Tampa Bay area at a time when it was after Anita Bryant had done her thing and not only gotten the repeal of the ordinance in Miami, but also passed the adoption law in Tallahassee, and then went on to national infamy. And the Tampa Bay area, Hillsborough County in particular, was really the epicenter of the second wave of hardcore homophobic organizing. It was a group called the American Family Association. So when we took it on in Tampa and in Hillsborough County, there were a lot of other places around the state that wanted to kind of learn the lessons, be prepared for what their talking points were, what were going to be their tactics and strategies. And it had made national news. I mean, we in Hillsborough County, there was a joint hearing of the City Council and County Commission. It was in the Performing Arts Center. The opposition bussed people in from Alabama and Georgia. Even police officers were wearing, some of them were wearing buttons of the opposition, and it was really, you can see how far Tampa's come. Now it has an out lesbian police chief, but that definitely was not the case back then. So, and it was interesting because in that hearing you had people who knew by stepping up to the microphone they were coming out to their friends, their co-workers, their families, and weren't certain if when it was all said and done they'd still have jobs. And so it was amazing to see. I mean, there were softball teams still in their, clay-caked, socks heading into there to talk, and people with beepers attached to their hip coming in from GTE and, the banks to come speak. And you had these real, firebrand pastors up there saying crazy things. I remember one guy who got up there, he said, "I see a lot of you in here, smirking, but you won't be smirking when Jesus returns. And I got to tell you, Jesus spanks, and he spanks hard." And it was all we could do not to get that on a t-shirt. But that night was a real turning point because what ended up happening is we prevailed in large part because the hatred that was on display answered the question of whether discrimination really existed. So for a couple of swing votes, it was, I was very touched by the stories told by people who've experienced discrimination, but I'm really moved to vote for this because of the hatred and the vitriol that's being spewed by people who claim discrimination doesn't exist against people they clearly hate. So it was it became the moment when the Tampa Bay area sort of was seen as the laboratory where the far right would conduct experiments. What about this talking point? What about describing? They used to say, if you pass these ordinance, it'll be legal for gay people to have sex on their desktops. They had lots of interesting theories on what the passage of these laws would do, and we hear it now as we talk about transgender issues. Every kind of lizard brain appeal to fear. And the difference is we've had years of success now. The majority of Floridians now live in cities that have non-discrimination policies. Many of them have had them for a decade or more. So the ability to say, the sky will fall if you pass these is undercut by the reality that those laws exist and none of these horror stories that they're trying to invoke actually happen. So we've had a lot of success in passing local human rights ordinances, domestic partnership ordinances, increasingly equal benefits ordinances. A lot of people don't realize that when you bar gay people from being able to get married, you also bar them from the financial benefits that come from marriage, including, everything from your spouse being able to, your partner being able to access health care with pre-tax dollars instead of post-tax dollars. Some of these things are beginning to change because the federal government is recognizing us as married, but the New York Times did an article that showed over the lifetime of the average couple that the penalties or opportunities lost to a gay couple could be as much as $500,000. So, that's your kid going to a very expensive college, that's the startup business, you don't have the funds to launch, but that's the penalty that's imposed on gay couples by unfair laws. So I think part of the reason that Florida has become a place where we have been very successful and drawn a great deal of attention, I think in part is because we're such a microcosm of the country. I mean, everything from it tips from red to blue very easily in presidential elections. It is massive. We're about to be the third largest state by population. It is so, the regional divide, the difference between being in Pensacola or Panama City versus being in Key West or West Palm Beach, the contrasts are stark. And so it is a microcosm, and even in the way attitudes are changing. So in 2008, 62% roughly of the population voted to make my marriage illegal in the state of Florida. Well, today, 57% of Floridians now support marriage equality. The tide has turned rapidly in the other direction. And now we have running for, governor, somebody who, just 4 or 5 years ago was, believed the way to get elected was to talk about conservative opinion, was to stake out positions in opposition to LGBT equality, and has now made LGBT equality a centerpiece of his run for governor, and he's very likely to become the next governor. So what has changed rapidly. It's changed dramatically, but not unexpectedly, because I think that at the core of all of it is people telling their stories. The transformation in Florida has been pretty remarkable, especially in these last 5 to 7 years, where we have seen Florida become one of the top-ranked states when it comes to the number of students protected from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We were able to get a state law passed and do it in such a way that we were able to get local school districts to enumerate categories, which is critical. So, we protect more students than all but I think 3 other states. We have the majority of our population now live in places where sexual orientation is part of the non-discrimination, and just over half now when it comes to gender identity as well. And the model that we've built here for passing local policies is one that's being adopted by other states, especially in the South, but also in the Midwest, as a model for how you move forward in a state where you have a very conservative legislature. In fact, a legislature that is really out of touch with the general population. And that's the case in Florida. If it were, I think our public education campaigns have been the most powerful because it really has been about people finding their voice, people finding a way to tell their story. I think one of the most important things we do when we talk to people about telling their story is we remind them that we don't need another person reciting the same statistics, the same sort of antiseptic information. We need people speaking from the heart about why marriage matters to them, or what it felt like to lose your job, or be denied a promotion simply because your manager was prejudiced. because those are the stories that really call the question and hold people morally accountable for their actions or their failure to act. So the biggest part of, I think, what we've contributed to the national movement has been to do this work in a diverse place, to do it in a place where the legislature is hostile and find pathways through that hostility. I mean, right now we have enough votes in the House to pass a statewide non-discrimination law. What we don't have right now is a governor or leadership willing to let that bill be heard. But the tide is turning, and or I would say we are turning the tide. And it's been exciting because, again, it is a journey. I'm married, and from the time I put on this wedding ring, I do a lot of traveling. And every time I get on a plane, it doesn't matter if I have headphones, a book in my hand, and a scowl on my face, people want to talk, especially if they've been drinking a good deal, which tends to be the person sitting next to me on every Southwest flight. So, the poison runs so deep that it's hard to know. So if someone says to me, "What do you do for a living?" I can answer, I work for a nonprofit. That's true. I can say I work for Equality Florida, also true. Or I can say I work for the statewide lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender equality organization, which is the truest thing I could say. And because I know from a very early age I was taught to hide or lie, I set a standard for myself that I will always say the third one. And it has been a very interesting journey as a consequence of that. I remember getting on one flight and people always ask me, what does my husband do? And I say, my wife runs a network of community gardens. And oftentimes that will end the conversation, which that works for me too. But usually it produces, I'm fine with that. And I'm tempted to go, oh great, let me write that down, because I was hoping a random stranger would be okay with my life today. But I don't, because people have to grow in their own pace. But one guy sat next to me, and he was a very inebriated Texan who had just come from visiting his daughter. And he was a very nervous flyer. When the plane took off, he almost ripped the armrest between us off. But because he was so nervous, he was also talking to me the whole time. So when he asked me what I did, and I answered, he said, I want to ask you something. He said, my wife and I got a divorce my daughter's senior year. So she's been at the college here for about a year. And she's been very distant. We used to be really close. I'd go to all of her softball games. Now I kind of know where he's heading with this story. And he said, but I just spent the last 3 days here, and we had a fine time, but I didn't meet any of her friends. And I know she's really sociable, and I know she's got lots of friends. And I think, so part of me was thinking that she's just very resentful about the divorce. But I'm also thinking she might be gay. And I don't know how to, I don't know what to do about that. And I asked him, I said, did you ask her? And he said, no, I don't want to do that. And if I ask her, and that just might make things worse. Anyway, so here's how it ended. I just said to him, why don't you tell her that you sat next to the head of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organization in the state of Florida, and that you had a lovely conversation, and that you expressed to me your strong support for equal rights for LGBT people, and if it turned out that one of your kids was gay, you would have no problem with that whatsoever. And that way you just leave the door open.